Hey everybody, welcome to a special edition of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and I have partnered up with the Blue Nature Alliance to put together a series of video and audio podcasts in and around marine conservation, essentially. We're going to talk about social equity. We're going to talk about people. We're going to talk about collaborations and partnerships, all in this series. This episode today, though, we're going to be talking about social equity in and through marine conservation. This is a really important topic that doesn't get discussed enough. There's a new paper that's out that we're going to discuss today with some of the authors, Dr. Asha de Vos, Dr. Anna Spalding, and Maël Imirizaldu. And we're going to talk about social equity. We're going to talk about what it means to have social equity in the marine conservation process. This is a great interview. It went a little longer than we first anticipated, but I assure you the amount of gems that are in this episode, in this interview, is amazing. I highly recommend you listen to the entire thing. If you have to come back and listen to bits and pieces, that's fine. We don't mind. The idea is to really get a discussion going on what it means to have social equity in marine conservation. So enjoy the interview, and I will talk to you after. Asha, Anna, and Maël, welcome to Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Are you ready to talk about equity in marine conservation?
Absolutely.
Oh, yes, sure thing.
Awesome. I am very excited about this. I feel that this is a topic that we don't talk about enough in marine conservation, and I am very excited that we get to talk about it on this episode. We have three people that are calling in from all around the world today. They are experts in their own realm. We're going to hear from each and every one of them in terms of who they are and what they do in a second. But this episode is based on a paper that was put on Frontiers, and I'm going to put a link in the show notes so everybody can get access to that paper. But we are going to essentially summarize and go through various points in the paper, but to get the full access, I want people to go to that link in the show notes to be able to be able to read everything, because I think it's one of the most important papers we have in marine conservation today. So I want to make sure everybody gets a handle on that. But without further ado, let's introduce everybody, because I want the listeners to get to know who everybody is and who they are. So, Asha, let's start off with you. Why don't you just you've been on the podcast before, so why don't you just remind us who you are and what you do?
All right, perfect. Well, I'm really excited to be here. I'm Dr. Asha de Vos, a marine biologist and ocean educator, and also executive director of Oceanswell here in the beautiful tropical island of Sri Lanka. And at Oceanswell, it's Sri Lanka's first marine conservation research and education organization. And really our goal through Oceanswell, establishing it, is I wanted to create a space for local researchers to come into this new field. Marine conservation is really new in Sri Lanka, but I wanted to create a space for more people to come in, because I believe in creating diverse ocean heroes and equipping people from across the developing world with all the skills that they need and empowering them to become marine conservationists. Because I truly believe if we want to save our oceans, every coastline needs a local hero.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. Love Oceanswell. Looking forward to hearing more about that in the future. Anna, how about yourself?
Thanks, Andrew. I'm super excited to be here with Asha and Maël, and obviously you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. As you said, so my name is Dr. Anna Spalding. I am from Panama originally. I was born and raised, but I currently live and work in Oregon at Oregon State University's School of Public Policy, where I'm an associate professor of marine and coastal policy. My work is applied, so I do applied human dimensions research. So I work with people, focusing on marine conservation and climate change. So I work in two main areas. Sort of globally, I work on MPAs and trying to understand the social outcomes and implications for people of MPAs. And then more site-based, I suppose, I work on climate change impacts of things like ocean acidification along the U.S. West Coast. I'd say that for me, what's really important is that my work is really grounded in place. So informed by what people need locally and their interests as well. So, for example, I worked in the Bocas del Toro archipelago in northwest Panama, that's right on the border with Costa Rica. And I was trying to understand social and environmental change that's driven from foreigners moving to the islands. And so really it's driven by local needs, local interests, local stories. To me, marine conservation is as important as the people that live in place, and it has to be for them, really. So I'm super excited to be here and talk some more with you all about equity in marine conservation.
Love it. Love it. I think it's going to be really important. I think that we're going to have a question on human dimensions in a second. So, and I think you're going to lead that one off, of course. and Maël, how about yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
Hi, Andrew, and thanks for having us today. I'm very, very stoked to be here. Actually, that's the first one for me. So I'm very pleased to participate in that podcast today and having that conversation. I'm for myself. I'm Marilyn Milzarjee. I'm French, but I grew up and spent most of my life in New Caledonia, a small island in the South Pacific, where I also worked for many, many years. But I've also been based in Australia, in the Sydney region for the past 10 years, which makes me a little bit of a nosy as well. As for my background, I've got that small marine science background, but did not really follow through the full academic path, but actually dived in quite early and very full on in marine conservation in my home island and beyond, trying to spend a lot of time on the field, trying to understand nature, but very, very early in the process, adding the people well-being in the equation, to try to understand, in the island and beyond how nature and people interact, how we can find the right balance into it. And I think I'm quite lucky. I've found my place. I've been working with CI for 9 years now, and I've been for the last 2 years, the regional officer for the Blue Nature Alliance. And we have one goal is to achieve protection of ocean, 18 square kilometers by 2025. So contribute to the achieving 30% by 2030. And so, I'm working in the region, try to provide the support and to understand how we can get there with local champions, with local governments and everybody. So that's a lot of work, but that's also great to feel part of that movement.
Fantastic. I mean, all of you, working in marine conservation in different parts of the world, obviously it's a huge necessity, and being part of this Blue Nature Alliance in some aspect or another is this huge endeavor. And I think it's really interesting because when I started, my master's was in marine protected areas in Canada. And I remember starting this, and it was all focused on, at the time for me, it was all focused on ecology and biology. So let's just find out where the animals are. Let's just protect them. And sort of in my head, when I first started, it was like, let's, we plop in a marine protected area, then boom, everything's fine. We don't have to worry about it. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying the process here. But there's always this other aspect. It's not just ecology. It's not just biology. It's that inclusion of that human aspect that has always been what I find now, we know a lot more about it, has always been the key factor in whether any kind of conservation sort of, quote unquote solution, whether it be a marine protected area or a locally managed area, is always based on, and success is always based on that human aspect, whether local people or at whatever scale you're looking at, whether they're going to say, yes, we're going to embrace it. It's going to happen. We'll work to help out as much as possible. But there's a lot more that goes into that. And that's where I feel like the paper that all of you are co-authors on, Advancing Social Equity in and through Marine Conservation, is so important. And I feel with equity, with everything that's going on around the world, equity has really become sort of this huge word. And I feel as though it's been a very difficult process for a lot of people to sort of take equity and start to think about putting in marine conservation. But it really starts off with that human dimension aspect of, marine conservation. So Anna, why don't you just kind of help us define, what does it mean to have like human dimensions in marine conservation?
Thanks, Andrew. That's super interesting what you just said about your experience. I'd say, so I've been working in conservation, terrestrial originally, but moved into marine, for over 20 years. And so I felt exactly the same thing, right? That's why I went into my master's in marine affairs and policy thinking, everyone's doing all of this, but we need the people, whether it's on the policy side or on the ground support and, people being okay with what is being done to their land and things like that. But I really thought I was sort of screaming out into the void, right? So it's been quite the journey to focus or to bring up this marine, the human dimension side. So this paper is super exciting to see so many people behind it. So I define the human dimension as that complex web of human processes as they relate to sort of non-human or basically natural resources. And we study it or we understand it, obviously in practice, just through how we engage with people, right? But also through what we call the social sciences and humanities. So on the ground, in practice, it covers all things human. It can cover histories, it can cover politics and policies. It can cover psychology, right? How we understand, how we relate to the environment and to each other, markets, capital, society, culture, language. So all the things that we relate to people. In the context of marine conservation specifically, it's all of those things as they relate to the marine environment, right? So you may think of a community and the culture of a community and how long they've been in place and what are the histories of relationship to place and political engagement over time, right? What kind of government structures do they have? And what's really important to mention, I'd say, in the human dimensions is that they can be both drivers of change. So for instance, development, coastal development, right? That's driven by people. So that is a driver of change. So when we think about humans causing climate change, for instance, or it can also be the impacts of change and or conservation initiatives, right? Which is the goal of this paper, is to be more thoughtful or mindful of how we do conservation. So an example of that would be the negative impacts of perhaps exclusion if we create a marine protected area, or displacement, and things like that. So the human dimension is not this monolith, right? It's as diverse as if you'd say natural science or biology. It includes a range of fields and areas of expertise, but it boils down to how people relate to the environment.
It's such an interesting aspect when we get to this point. Asha, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say, I always say, and I know we all of us say this, but people don't realize it, that really 99% of conservation is people management, right? I mean, that's what it boils down to. We can pretend that we can protect a species or a habitat or an ecosystem, but there are people in those spaces, and we've for too long separated people from nature, and that's sort of kind of where the collision happens, and that's where our lack of success has happened. And even in our work, I mean, I was trained as a marine biologist. I came through the biological streams. That's that traditional kind of viewpoint. But I guess my advantage was that I grew up in a country where I could see the complexities of what was happening, right? I would go down to the beach, and there'd be fishermen, and the kids would play with us. And as they played with me, for me, it was obvious that, like, if I wanted to protect those fish, I had to also understand that man had a family to feed. But I realized when I moved I did all my university in sort of the West, and I realized that the mentality was very different. It was very much like, if we want to save our oceans, we have to stop fisheries, right? And with no real consideration for the people. And to me, that was kind of frustrating. And it is still kind of a pervasive thought, because I think we're still transitioning to that idea of, like, we need to include people. We're all part of this. And if we're not in it together, we're not going to be successful. But it is a really interesting, and as much as I say I'm a marine biologist, a lot of the work that we do has a very big social dimension to it, from understanding why people go and fish illegally in other waters, like Sri Lankan fishermen, to understanding how, things that happen on the ground impact these communities, so we can help these communities better, so we can have more successful conservation efforts. And so it's a very deep part of the kind of work we do as well.
Absolutely. Maël, did you have the same sort of observation growing up in New Caledonia? Sort of like looking, when you do marine biology, but you're doing it around people who are ocean users essentially, and are using it in different ways. Did you have the same type of sort of observations?
Yeah, sure thing. There's something funny that we're saying here. It's like we have to unlearn or to relearn to put social into the conservation practice, where it's always been connected. Nature and people have been there, and conservation practice across the globe in different ways, in different cultures, have been applied those principles. So it's a funny thing that coming to the global conservation area now, we sort of need to put that back into practices, because we came so far in thinking about nature and preservation and everything, that actually we need to come back to it. One funny thing about my own experience is that when I grew up in New Caledonia, there is one simple thing that you do when you go someplace and you like on a remote beach where it seems to be nobody around. Like, if you see someone, you go and ask if you can stay here. you go and ask if you have the permission to stay here, you know, or if there is anything you should do to stay here. And that's a funny thing because it's coming from growing in the island and following that respect, you know, and humility when come to a place. But then it transposed directly into practice. I came from this place where actually when I started doing conservation practice, you better acknowledge people from the place and people from there, because otherwise you don't do anything. There is no way anything is going to work if you don't acknowledge people and work with them. So I come from that as well, background in marine science, where I put my head a lot into the science and nature and process and ecology and a lot of things that is super useful. But then that's funny that when you come into practice, then you are confronted to, oh, there's people around and I should actually consider those people because it ain't going to work or otherwise. So yeah, super important thing.
Something I never would have thought about too. And I think that's what's important of having that local knowledge, right? Of just the local culture. It makes such a big deal. And Asha, just what you were saying too, is just the differences in the thought processes from people in Sri Lanka to people in the West who seem to have a lot of the same sort of theoretical policies when it comes to marine conservation. It's a very different aspect. And is it a very similar thing in Panama? Like, what's it like to do conservation? And in Panama, I'm assuming you have done conservation in Panama, but what's it like there in terms of approaching people, from, you're from the US, but you have, the roots there. What's it like in that respect?
I would say it's exactly the same thing. So I was born and raised in Panama. I'm Panamanian. So having that very direct observation relationship with people, with nature, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, reading a paper or reading a website about some great new conservation initiative. This is what we're going to do. And I'm like, wait, that's not going to work here, right? I mean, I know the people, I know the government, I know the place. I'm like, how can you just create this generic map of action for Sri Lanka or New Caledonia or Panama? They're so different, right? And the experiences are so different. And so, yes, and that's what I was saying. Like, that was my shock in a way, right? Sort of thinking, they really think this is going to work? Like, I'm only, 19, 20 when I started, and I know it's not going to work, but they're the bosses, right? They must know something I don't. Let me study until I know. And I'm still thinking the same thing 20 plus years later. I'm like, oh, it's not going to work.
I think that it matters every time we talk about marine conservation in a new country. It definitely matters, and I guess that's where the social equity comes into place, right? But it's, for me, as a biologist and ecologist who's not trained with human dimensions, or I don't have a ton of experience dealing with people like doing marine conservation in various countries. Asha, what does it mean when we talk about social equity? Like, that's where I'm trying to sort of get my mind around it.
Okay, so social equity by definition is fairness and justice in how people are treated or public policies are formulated and implemented, right? So simply saying, look, it's how we actually treat people when we're trying to do stuff, when we're trying to drive change, how inclusive are we, how diverse are we with the voices, the stakeholders that are there? Are we allowing everyone not just to be at the table, but to actually have that opportunity to voice their thoughts and for others to listen? Because, it's one thing to say, as a token gesture, let's have these people at the table to have this kind of conversation because it's great to have them here. But it's another thing completely to really listen to what their concerns are. And when we think about social equity, or, that leads to much more equal partnerships, these inclusive partnerships, a lot of the time pushback is, it takes a lot of work and it'll take too long to establish the project because we have to work so hard in these communities and they don't understand, right? We have this very dismissive kind of view about how these communities will respond. So in my case, obviously I work in communities, and that's just the wrong approach, right? Because one thing is, the reason they're resistant is because for far too long we haven't been equitable, right? We've always had other people from outside coming into these spaces and being like, you do this because this is right? But what is right? If we go back to what Anna was saying, right? If we go back to what Maël was saying, all our communities function so differently, right? So what is right and wrong in our different spaces, they vary, and we have to be we have to be more humble. And as a marine scientist, as someone who wants to implement marine conservation, kind of my biggest learning is that I have to be humble. I need to learn to listen. I need to be patient. And I have to understand, if I want long-term goals, it is about building that amazing team of everybody, right? Amazing team of everybody, and not being really inclusive and acknowledging that there are these amazing voices, people who lived in these spaces for generations, who can contribute far more than I can, having studied in university for, whatever, how many years for my degrees, right? This is on the ground experience. And I'm not saying that there's no place for that. There's absolutely place for all of us, but we have to sit as equals around a table and speak, make space, and listen if we are going to have long-term change. And these allies that we create now, so it's an investment we make now for long-term allyship and for sustainability of these marine conservation agendas that we have.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's so interesting, when you go back at how marine conservation has been going on and how it's been approached in the past. It was just, okay, here are the marine protected areas, deal with it. And a lot of times they would fail because either the fishing community would be like, well, this is where we fish. Like, why can't we fish here? And so they weren't included in that aspect. I also think it's a really interesting point you brought up of, once you're at the table, do you have a voice? Because I know here in Canada, we see a lot where different users have almost like it's a different equitable sort of stake at who could speak and who can have a say in different aspects. And I think when I see that, it's like, well, this isn't going to work right off the bat, because each ocean user wants a say at the table. And you see that here in Canada. So I can just imagine what happens, other places. And this is where it gets really difficult to include everybody, because I think everybody's like, well, this process is going to take so long. And Maël, you brought up sort of the 30 by 30, right? We want to protect 30% of the ocean, 30% of the land by 2030. There's a bit of a time crunch here. I know it's 9 years away, but there's a bit of a time crunch here. And there is that aspect of, if we include everybody and everybody has an equal say, it's going to take longer to do that. What do you say in terms of, that whole, like, keeping everybody, having that equity at the table and being able to do these marine protected areas? Is it still possible? And will it be more successful by doing that?
You know what? Yeah, there is that rush because of the global context, because of a lot of things that happen across the world where we are huge to move forward. But this is not new. This is coming for many years before. And even like if the bells is ringing more and more, we still need to go. The thing is, because running after some goal, we tend to be, it's always a very general way that I say, yeah, it's the whole community, but tends to be focused on that very, very simple goal. And I need to achieve protection. I need to do this. Then most often you don't take the time to have that step back and get the big picture. What do we want? We want some long lasting results, right? And whatever time we can spend on the side as conservation practitioners and others, it's only going to be like that small step in the whole conservation journey of an area, of a region, of a community, of people. So what did you say, Asha? Humbleness, being able is already a good place to start with, because when you can, then you realize, yeah, there is, I'm just helping out. I'm just helping. I'm just providing the support that I can for the time that I can, right? But if you want some long-lasting support, this is where you need the local support. This is where you need the political will. This is where you need all those different factors that will actually carry away the small pieces that you brought on the table. Because again, it depends on people living on site, and they are the ones that are going to carry on that legacy of ocean conservation. So yeah, there is a urge to bring more people around the table and bring more voices around the table. And to do so, that's where we need to make sure that we have the social equity as a core element, because otherwise nobody is going to want to join the table, right? If you don't have the right rules and if you don't operate rightly. So let's bring more and more voices. Let's raise the wave, but then let's make sure that as well that as we do this, we don't rush for the targets. We don't rush for the results, for the numbers, but we actually race for something that is durable, and long lasting.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I have a question for you. And with your experience, we kind of mentioned, and I know time is not a huge factor because it's more about success, but there's a bit of like a time and success balance in terms of when we talk about conservation. When people are brought to the table, and in let's say, I'm going to say theoretical right now because my next question has to do with in terms of how we're doing, but in terms of like when people are brought to the table, does it take, quote unquote, too long? And is it more successful if everybody has a voice at the table? Are there examples of that we could, say, yes, it's actually better that way?
Oh goodness, yes. I mean, there are so many examples of locally led conservation efforts. I can think of, again, terrestrial, sort of from my early days in Panama, thinking about the establishment of protected area and on the Atlantic side of the country. Definitely in the protected areas and PAs that I work in now on the Pacific side, there's sort of a very, it's a really interesting governance structure for Coiba National Park that is very inclusive of the local governments as well as the fishermen. Sort of their different Consejo Consultivo, sort of a consultative committee that is formed by local agencies, local governments, as NGOs, research institutions. So it's one of the only national parks and PAs in Panama that has that structure. And I would definitely say it's one of our sort of our flagship MPAs in that example. To your question about time, though, I think one of the challenges we face is thinking that we're starting from zero. I mean, local people understand the environment and understand a lot of times the system, whether it's from a scientific understanding or whether it's from just a use understanding and the fact that there have been there for a long time. So we're not starting from zero, right? There is an intent or a willingness to do some sort of conservation. I think the challenge is whether it's imposed or brought in from outside, as opposed to something that's driven by the local community. And something else I would want to say, sort of going back to my initial comment of how we understand sort of on the ground versus perhaps the drivers of change. I think that's what's really important as well. In parsing that out a little bit in terms of thinking, okay, the drivers of change aren't always, and actually most of the times are not local, right? It's very easy to blame the local fishermen for overexploitation. But if we break it down into, there's a market, there's a demand that's driven by something else. There's climate change that's occurring and driven by activities elsewhere that are really affecting the resources. So not to push the academic side of things, but as a social scientist, I would definitely say that it's as important to understand the scale, the drivers of change, being able to tell that story, not just people are important. Yes, of course they are. But how do we understand who is driving the change, who is being affected, what are the drivers of action, collective action at the local level? That's really important. And we don't know enough about it. We have not spent as much time as we have on the ecological and biological side as we have on the social side. So that's super, super important to see.
Even trying to, assess it's got to be, especially from the social science perspective, it's got to be so unique in every single locale that it's really hard to generalize sort of overarching principles of how to approach the human dimension aspect of conservation, because every place is unique. Every person is unique in the way they approach, how they just regulate themselves if they don't already have marine conservation principles in place. I mean, they might have one, just not the way we identify with it, but they might have their own way of managing it, but it's going to be unique in every place. And we talk about this social equity. And in the paper, it's a lot of times like, there's a lot of suggestions in terms of how to move forward, with these principles. And it's great to talk about these principles. In theory, you're like, yes, this makes sense. But there's got to be a little trick in terms of how do we operationalize these solutions. So I'm going to ask each and every one of you, what your opinion is on that, and sort of your, coming from your own sort of background. So Asha, we'll start with yourself. How do we operationalize social equity in conservation, especially, with this 30 by 30, there's going to be a big push from sort of the global marine community to get a lot of protection in. But it's going into, just like the Blue Nature Alliance, it's going into these, not going into working with these communities, around the world, a lot of them local communities. How do we operationalize social equity so that it functions well and people are happy with the process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I'm just going to reflect for a second on the 30 by 30, right? Just going back on what everyone else is also saying is that one thing we have to remember is we've had these goals, these kinds of goals before as well, right? But why we're still in the same place. And that's because business as usual has not worked, right? That's because we have always prioritized the ecology and, the species and the habitat and not the people. So I want to remind us, as much as we can keep saying, oh, but do we have time? We have to do something different. All this time, if we've been thinking we didn't have time, we've failed, right? So how are we what's the difference we can make? It's very simple. It's being inclusive, right? And, as a person, we all want to feel included, right? And if someone kept telling me that I was always doing it wrong and I was not good enough and I didn't have enough information and I was not useful, and then suddenly came to me and said, hey, we need your help because we need to do this thing. This is where we have this breakdown, right? We haven't been inclusive. So I want people to just to reflect on that for a second. 30 by 30 is one of many targets that we've set for ourselves. And we've got paper parks across the world because we have not included people, right? But going back to how do we operationalize this, right? How do we make sure that there's social equity? So I'm going to talk quite personally from where I come from, right? I'm Sri Lankan. I'm very unique. There weren't marine biologists doing what I did before I started. Sri Lankans thought I was crazy because they didn't know what a marine biologist was going to do, right? But when I started out, I was at the butt end of all this social inequity, right? People kept telling me that, oh, you can't do the research in your own country because you don't know what to do. I mean, a foreign researcher would say, I can come and do it, right? This whole concept of parachute science, which fits right into this conversation, right? People kept telling me what I couldn't do. Luckily for me, I have very thick skin and I was not going to let anybody take this away from me, right? But that was really, I'm really glad I went through that. I'm really glad that people picked on me and started trying to tell me that I was not good enough, because that meant I rose to the occasion. And that means that everything I do, absolutely everything I do today, is steeped in this desire to increase justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right, in marine conservation. I mean, I am on fire when it comes to this topic because for me, it's so personal. I know what it feels like, right? Knowing what I know, knowing what I've been through, knowing that I have the capacity, knowing that damn right, I'm great. I can do this work, right? I don't need people telling me no, right? And so the point is, I don't mean to sound cocky, but I am just trying to make the point that it's really important for us, right, to empower people and allow and bring people in. So I had the opportunity. I did all my degrees out of Sri Lanka because I couldn't study marine biology in Sri Lanka, right? Because it is a very new field. But I had the opportunity to stay out of the country and continue to prosper in my career. My choice was to always, from the day I left my country at 18, my desire was to always come back and change what was happening, to create opportunities, to make sure we had local leaders on the ground. So I built Oceanswell, not because I wanted to build an organization, but because I wanted to make sure there was a home for all these amazing young researchers who now believe that marine conservation is a job they can do, right? And through my work, I have the opportunity to build projects that can bring them into the fray, right? That helps them to feel empowered, to look after their own coastlines, that allows them to go into their own communities, okay? So even our research, if we build a collaboration with a foreign institution, and I have lots of amazing colleagues from across the world, the whole model is that they're there to help us to build the capacity and grow these people and nurture them so that they can be the leaders. We have young researchers going to their communities, leading projects, right? They are the faces of our project. I'm just there to advise and guide. My collaborator across the pond is literally there to help us and to build this up. We are mutually benefiting from this because, yeah, they have expertise, but we have so much local knowledge. And, we are using people who grew up in these communities, which means trust is huge, which means we can ask the questions that nobody else can. I mean, you can't have an outsider come and ask a fisherman, why are you illegally fishing in other waters? But if their child who has an interest in conserving the environment then goes and says, hey, why are you fishing illegally in other waters? Like, why are you taking this? That's when we get answers, right? And that is what we need to build into this. So from where I sit, yeah, it's all about local leadership. It's about really making sure I'm empowering people in Sri Lanka, but also in the developing world, because 70% of our coastlines are in the developing world, but representation from this part of the world is next to nothing. And if we want to save our oceans, we need all these places represented and listened to and to have a voice. And also, I think, for us, we recognize that the fishermen that we work with, the boat operators that we go out with, are our greatest resource. The success of the research we do is not just because we can do statistics. It's because these fishermen are helping us. They're supporting us. They're giving us their decades of information. They're part of our team. And that's what makes these projects successful, right? And that's when we start to see change. They feel empowered too. They're like, they want to know more, right? They want to understand, okay, what can I do better as a result? Because suddenly they're like, yeah, let's talk, and that's super, super important as well. And I mean, it's about going back, when we talk about making sure that everyone's kind of like, maximizing benefits, right? And with our work, we also go back in any community I work with, whatever team's working, we always go back into those communities to give them the information we just collected from them. We collate it, we come up with maybe recommendations, thoughts, and analyze the data. But what's the point if we don't give it back? And that's a traditional problem. A lot of these communities shut down because they feel that people extract information from them, but never even come. That simple act of going back in, sitting with them and saying, hey, this is what we learned from talking to you guys, right? How important, how simple is that? But that is important. And that to me, those are the kinds of steps we take at Oceanswell. It's incredibly important for me. And I fully advocate for social equity in every aspect of the work we do. Oh, and also the last thing I will say is I will say with, there's so many layers, right, of social equity. If you think about philanthropy and stuff like that, that has a huge role to play. I have walked away from thousands of dollars because I've had a foreign funding body give me money, but tell me how I was going to spend that money in a way that was going to destroy not just my career, but also the career of my students, because they didn't understand the political reality. And that's a really great example of being so blind to the ground situation that they didn't care. Their objective was to spend that money and tick the box. But our objective was to drive change. And to drive that change, it's so important that you understand what's happening on the ground. I can give you thousands of examples. But just to say, it happens at so many layers. And I think we have so many, ways that we have to change this model.
Completely agree. Maël, you're smiling. Do you have anything to add to Asha in terms of like, how do we operationalize these? I mean, Asha covered quite a bit of it, and it makes sense. It definitely makes sense from your perspective. Maël, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Asha, you're on fire. I love that. No, I think there is a couple of things you said that you're like, everything is great, and there's one thing that there is more and more people coming into the arena of conservation and young leaders and conservation practitioners that come with social principle like in their backpack. It's there. They are asking for it, and they hold industries and conservation world and governments accountable for everything. So, I mean, that's a good thing about it. There is people around coming up and there is people pushing the walls and raising voices. So that's a very great thing about it. I think when you don't come from the social science world and or the trainings, there's clearly a learning curve to transfer from good intentions into practice. And the earlier you start considering this into your own practice, and try to materialize that, the better it is. I think there is one before thinking about the individual. I think there is definitely a organizational approach of it. You definitely need the enabling environment within your institution to be able to do that. You need to feel as an individual being supported by your organization in approaching those questions, and embedding this into your practice. So I think there is definitely something that needs to come from the institution and through different ways, code of conducts, grievance mechanisms, trainings, sharing and learning, creating actually basically a culture about that consider social equity as a core element of what you are doing. So I think you definitely need that enabling environment, and that comes as well at the government level with the laws and policies in place and science, everything. But then I think when it comes to you, you need to put it into practice. And so there is a couple of principles that you can follow. There is some guide, and this paper that we wrote together is trying to provide some very nice framework for getting to it, and putting it into practice. So yeah, practice is key. You need to have a process. You can have a code of conducts and principle, but you sort of need to have a process that you try and try and try again, because the first time you're not going to tick all the boxes. But like, again, it's the intention that you put into it and the learning that you have that will make your practice better and yourself people more considerate to others, So, I mean, it means as well, again, back on the taking the time, you need to do your homework, learn and listen when you come to a place. This means that, that conservation is not anymore a quick shot. It means that when there's people to attach to a place, well, you just need to acknowledge that in the first place. You need to build the time to establish relationship before it is a partnership, right? So trust building is key. And again, this depending of if you got the right approach, it can go more or less fast, that's for sure. But again, you're gonna win in the long run because once you have established trust and relationship and put into practice your principles, then yeah, you have the right enabling environment as well in the play that will actually help you and everybody, all your partners, in the project, getting it to the finish line. So yeah, I think it's coming from the right structure that you have with you and put it into practice, and eventually over time, well, everybody learns. You get the feedback, and once you're good with that, you can learn, share back, and adapt your practice. So yeah, start with that.
Gosh, what else is there to say? No, I absolutely right. No, I absolutely agree. No, and actually, I love that we're all sort of coming from different perspectives, right? Sort of the conservation organization and on the ground, and obviously, I'm firmly grounded in academia for now. So I guess a couple of things: how to operationalize it. I think something that Asha said is super important, right? Like, look at what. Who's asking the questions and the kinds of answers they're getting. I mean, that's so important. That's key for the work we do as social scientists, right? We do interviews, we do surveys. And so I did my PhD research in Panama in place, and there was another woman doing a very similar project, but she wasn't from Panama and had an interpreter and sort of was asking questions and got different answers. I'm not saying they were incorrect. She did her work really, really well, had a fantastic local partner doing the work. But it was just different, right? I mean, this is an island in the Caribbean. I have Afro-Caribbean descent. I've lived in the States, so I could easily engage with the foreigners as well as the locals. I mean, the things people told me half the time I was pregnant. So like the women in the communities were like, oh, come, we've lived the same thing. So all of these things were just so amazing. What opens doors is really, really interesting. So that's super important. So what do I do personally for operationalizing issues of equity? The first thing I do is elevating the role of social sciences, right? If I can define, describe, explain what it is we do as social scientists, and open that path for the next generation of marine social scientists, that's a lifelong passion of mine. So recognizing this through social science, we can understand those structures, right? So the guiding principles we list in the paper, so recognition, there are social science methods that allow us to understand how we can recognize people. What are the distribution of benefits and costs? There are social science methods that allow us to measure those, right? It's very easy to say, oh, we need to understand who gets the benefits and who loses. That's what an economist might be able to help us understand, right? Procedures, a political scientist might be able to help us really understand the policy structure and how that works on the ground. So I know it sounds sort of really academic-y and boring, but that is there is a whole area of study that focuses on these things, and they're not, as I said it already, right? There are not enough people doing that. The second thing I really focus on is helping social scientists, so through mentoring as an academic, right? One of our things we do is mentor. I like to pride myself on mentoring international students, women and people of color. they rightly so probably seek me out, but and just saying, hey, you know what, it's okay to go do your research in your home country, because we're often told, similar to what Asha was saying, that you can't go to your home country to do your research. And I'm like, no, you can, and you are the expert, and you will bring so much more by doing that. So I totally empower them to do that. I have a PhD from Panama. I have a PhD from Belize who did work in Belize. I have a student from Okinawa doing work. I mean, it's just so awesome to see them go back to their countries and become the experts, right? Become the next Asha de Vos in place. I mean, just in place, you know. And I guess the third thing I'd want to say is when we think about MPAs, right? We think of it as a goal as conservation and increasing biodiversity. Right. So if we have a goal and that's biodiversity, then what we're going to measure in terms of the outcomes is going to be biodiversity. But if we care about people and the social equity, then somehow we have to include that as a goal, as a target as well. Right. Whether it's human well-being, whether it's happiness, you know, whatever you want to call it, but make that as an intentional goal so that then we can measure, because that's how we're going to identify whether we've been successful, or I like to say effective, not successful necessarily. But I think that's a really important way of operationalizing it, right? We can't measure what we haven't set out as a target or as a goal. And so if we really want to make sure we have social equity, okay, well, so what are the things we want to measure to make sure that we're there and hold ourselves accountable, right? Be reflexive, be thoughtful and mindful of the work that we're doing on the ground. So that's how I like to think I operationalize it. We'll see if it works.
Butterflies in my stomach. So I might be the right audience for this kind of thing, because it's exciting to hear. Like, you never thought about, you know, people coming to a university in the West or in North America, and then like they come from a different country and they only do research within the country where they're doing university, instead of going home and doing, you know, that's where they want to do the research. That's where they want to advance marine conservation. That's what inspired them, you know, whether it be the coastline or their parents or whoever, like the local leaders. That's what inspired them to go and go into their own home and do their own research. And that's it's so empowering, just right off the bat. And I'm sure it comes with its challenges of managing a student that's in a different country and so forth. So thank you for doing that. First of all, like, it's just amazing. And everybody all three of you it's amazing, all the work that you guys have been able to do and all the people that you've been able to inspire through the mentoring aspect. And hopefully we'll see more of this equity kind of come to place as you have more local leaders kind of speak out and understand not only the social science aspect, but also the marine conservation aspect in their own countries, so that when it does come time to do marine conservation, or as they're doing marine conservation, they're able to be at the table and get other people at the table as well. But, you know, we talk about this as, hey, this is an easy thing. Like, this is what we need to do. Let's go do it. But there's obviously barriers to that. Like, it's not an easy thing to do because we haven't been able to do it yet. And well, we have, but not in a sort of a global context. And are there still barriers to social equity, and what are those barriers? Maël, we'll start with you on this one. What do you think those barriers are?
That's a hard question. I think that there is a lot. If advancing social equity was another thing, we wouldn't put a paper in the first place and have social scientifics, you know, raising the voice and bring so much thought into it. It's not an easy one. And there is potentially a few barriers. Again, what I said in my previous comment, maybe the institutional, enabling environment, you know, is one of them. Not all organizations actually put that into their core elements, and not all organizations actually support their, members to advance that in their practices. Adequate resources. There is a lot of capacity building and capacity development around it to make sure that everybody, like, for think about social indicators in their MPA project, or think about the social science behind it. So I think adequate resources. Asha, I think you touched on that on the philanthropics world, you know, and the donors. A lot of money coming into conservation. We need to. Well, there is a need as well to advance the culture in that sphere as well. So the philanthropic world can prioritize as well social equities, social benefits, and well-being of people within the conservation project. So actually, when you have resources, you have you can use them actually and dedicate them to the social piece, to the social component of your project, and not only the science and nature and conservation and all of this. So I think individual bias, you need some learnings and knowledge and skills to put that into practice. So again, come back to the adequate resources that your organization and the donors can help you with. So yeah, I would pass it over to Asha or Anna to complete my thought, but that's what I can think of to begin with.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, Maël, just to say, in terms of the philanthropy, the other thing I think with philanthropy is, who are they funding? Quite often what happens is the money will go to the outside partner, the person from the global north, say, and so they come in, and that, money creates power, let's be honest, right? So you get this unfavorable power imbalance that happens, and then, it's already this formulated project, there's already money to it, and all they need to do is implement, right? So then it's coming, and there's no chance for social equity in that instance. And I think that we need to start holding our funders responsible also. Is like, where's the money being channeled? The excuse I hear is, oh, but there's always mismanagement if you give it to a small country or a small organization. I'm like, that's rubbish. We handle our own funds. And because I handle my funds, I'll apply for grants, I'll get money. I can invite then who I want to come and support the project that needs to happen based on the priorities in my country. And I think that's the model that we should be thinking about. So that's something to think about, money and power. Like, that's a very big thing. But also academia, right? We think about academia. I was an academic. I fled because I don't believe in the model, because I don't think there's room for, we all have different experiences, but as a Sri Lankan, I felt like the model was just so focused on these publications. What does that do, right? That means everybody wants to be the first author on the paper. That means everyone wants to go to that exotic destination and, be the first person to write about that whale that the locals have been watching forever, by the way, just FYI. But just because that you come in and write that one paper, your career will skyrocket, right? And so we basically feed into this. We feed this monster with the systems that exist. And people will say, well, that's an easy metric because publications, we can count the publications and, these factors that tell us whether the paper is good or not. But what does it matter? It's not even if it's not even translating on the ground, right? So we need to change the metrics of how academia is also celebrated. I mean, I know for a fact I've had people tell me when I was in academia, they'd be like, oh, well, what's the point? Because I have a Muppet that looks like me. This is possibly not a great example, but right, people were just like, you have a Muppet, how can you be a real scientist? But I'm like, you know what? 5 million people watched a video about the whales in Sri Lanka. And do you know how many Sri Lankans now actually know there are whales and care to protect that environment, right? It doesn't matter how I'm doing it, right? At the end of the day, we should be thinking about translation. We should be taking it back to communities, to people, to countries. I mean, the success of what I do has been multiple things, including relatability. People look at me and they're like, she's one of us. If she can do it, I can do it. That's a fact. I'm not special, right? Secondly, it's access to resources, right? And I've had some access to resources, but I'm creating access to resources because, again, I believe that, that the answer to our next greatest ocean challenge will come from a young researcher in the developing world, right? All I do in life is about creating opportunities by opening doors. That's all I care to do, right? And we need to be open and inclusive, and we have to be confident enough and not afraid to let other people in. And that is a key thing, I think. And that humility is so important for all of us. I think particularly as a scientist, I see that fear of losing my power, my role. If a person who doesn't have a PhD is speaking up, who cares? What does that degree do? At the end of the day, we want action. And action doesn't need a piece of paper. Action needs passion and hard work. And really as a person who's on the ground.
Nodding your head a lot to that, what Asha was saying. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think, I think that the Asha's and Maël's point, I mean, so, he's talking from an institutional culture, probably from a conservation organization, Asha's sort of critique of academic institutions, right? We have to change the values and metrics across all institutions. Like, what do we value in terms of the work that we as, I mean, I don't know if you want to call yourselves mid-career or advanced career, like, you know, in our own positions of power right now, because we are in a position where we have the ability and the possibility to support people that are coming through, and to and increasingly have a platform and a voice that people are listening to. So it's changing that value and that metric of what is considered, you know, okay and good to do. Definitely power asymmetries are another barriers. Of course, lack of social science. You know, I'll say that, but but I also think that training, right? I mean, absolutely, we need to train and provide capacity building for locals. I also think it's really important. So I'm affiliated with the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute here in Panama, and before I went off to Oregon State, we were doing a workshop for the fellows, the up and coming scientists, on international collaborations for research in the tropics. And part of that workshop, so we developed it, I co-developed it with a colleague. She's also in an institution in the US right now as a professor, but she's from Peru. And we were just saying, basically, like, when you go in as a postdoc or as a master's student or as whatever, someone doing research, and you have a local support, a local collaborator, like, and you all of a sudden continue to rise through the ranks, and they're still the person that's sort of helping you do the research on the ground. Don't forget them, right? Because when you started out as an intern, they were your friend, and then all of a sudden you're their boss, and you sort of continue to see them as that. And it's that. So that was one of the basic principles. It's like, you know, think of them as yourself as you move along. As you create opportunities for yourself, create opportunities for them as well. So all kinds of sort of ethical and bringing to light the fact that they have access to funding that some of their partners on the ground don't. So how do we train that generation? Because as Maël mentioned, right, there is that passion, right? I love the passion that the students are bringing. So let's leverage that now and say, okay, we'll bring that to bear as you continue to grow in your careers and in your passion and concern for a local place. So not just the locals, but also the foreigners.
This has been so educational, and there have been so many what I like to call value bombs in this actual episode. I think this is an episode that people are going to have to go back and listen to again and again and again, because all three of you have brought up so many great points in terms of how we start implementing social equity into marine conservation. And I just can't thank you enough for the work that you've done in the past, the work that you continue to do, and also being so adaptive to sort of the changing times and just continuing to get better and to find the best places. I mean, I know each and every one of your careers are challenging enough to lead this kind of way. And so I appreciate all the work that you do. And I appreciate the time that you've dedicated to us today to be able to, you know, sort of share that work with you. So thank you so much for being on the episode. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
All right, and as we wrap up, you bet. As we wrap up, I want to thank you so much. What we'll do is we'll put all of your, anywhere you can get contacted, whether it be social media or anything like that, in the show notes. So I just want to, again, thank you so much, and love to have each and every one of you back on the podcast individually to really dig deep into what you guys do. And I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Pleasure,
you.
Andrew.
Thanks.
Thank you, Asha, Anna, and Maël for joining us on this episode of a special episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Really enjoyed today's discussion on social equity, something that we don't discuss enough in marine conservation. If you want to find out more information, you can go to the website for Blue Nature Alliance. It's bluenaturealliance.org. It's in the description below. I highly recommend that you go check it out. There's a specific link to the post that has the link to the paper. Highly recommend that you read it, especially if you're interested in putting together and incorporating social equity in marine conservation. I want to thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. By the way, if you don't have a chance to watch this whole video, you can check out the audio podcast over at speakupforblue.com. Check that out in the links below. We'll give you access to the exact episode. We have a lot of episodes on that podcast. But anyway, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. Tune in for the next episode. It'll be up soon. Highly recommend that you check out all of them, especially if you're really interested in marine conservation. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Talk to you soon, and happy conservation.